We're continuing in our third week of our series called Thanksgiving, taking that holiday word and breaking it up into two, giving thanks and giving back. And today we want to kind of shift to the giving portion. We've been talking a lot about Thanksgiving awareness, being aware of our gifts, and I wanted to talk with you about giving a little bit too. First thing about giving, though, I wanted to think with you a little bit about why we give. And giving is an interesting thing if you look at studies around health and mental health and things like that. So there's actually three things I wanted to talk about that are good reasons to give. So here's one thing, and I might have mentioned these before, but I think they're so fascinating, so I'll mention them again. One is that when they studied happiness in a huge study across thousands of people, thousands of acts you can do, giving was the number one thing linked with happiness. People who give more are actually mentally happier than people who don't. That's not a promise to say if you give, you'll be the happiest person in the world the next day. But just to say psychologically, giving is linked with happiness. It's almost as if we were meant to do it. So that's the first thing. Happiness is linked to giving. Secondly, this was a really interesting study. They studied people and their mortality and how long they live. And what they discovered was, especially as people get more aged, people who live longer are those who figure out ways to continue giving. And of course, the ways they continue giving might be different from when they were younger. But what a study determined was that unless someone has a sense of purpose where they give back, they probably won't live very long. So those who retired into just hanging out at home and watching TV had lower mortality than those who, say, took care of their grandkids or volunteered or donated their stuff or prayed. Some sense of purpose in giving back actually makes people live longer. So that's a second thing. And then a third thing is the faith component, which is to say, I think all of us, if we've had a sense of Jesus, if we've had a sense that we've been forgiven and saved and loved and we're welcomed into this community, we have a sense that we're blessed and we have a sense that we want to give back. And so, based on all those things, and there's probably lots of more reasons, there are lots of reasons to be giving people. And so today I wanted to, along with those three reasons to give, think with you about three attitudes that help us become more giving people. Three attitudes that we can learn from Jesus. So the first one is that giving happens when we choose to create hope rather than just waiting for it. So giving happens when we choose to create hope rather than just waiting for it. So, something I've noticed, it's true of myself sometimes, it's certainly true of lots of people in humanity, is that we tend to have this idea that there was a time in the past that was like the golden age where everything was perfect, and today things are a lot worse. You may not always feel like that. You may have a good day or a good experience and things are going well. But I'd say a lot of people, especially as they live their life, they look back and they say, things were better back here, right? Back here, people were nicer and kinder and blah, blah, blah. And I had a friend who was posting on Facebook. He was kind of feeling down, and he was talking about how the last few years in our country just feels like a hard time, and we all know that in certain ways it is a hard time. There's lots of division and, obviously lots of hungry people and people who are desperate coming to the border and violence and all this kind of stuff. So I was thinking about what he was putting, that, things are getting worse and they used to be better. And I kind of like history, so I was starting to think about history and even my own history, how old I am in my 30-something years. And I was thinking about, on a surface level, I could say that I also think it's kind of a hard time in history in our particular era, in our particular country. There's some division, there's some negativity. And I thought, when I was growing up in the 90s, things seemed a little simpler and more united and all this kind of thing. But then I started thinking, that was true if you were growing up in my area as someone like me in the 90s. But in the 90s was also the Rwandan genocide, right? So if you were in Rwanda, it was not better in the 90s. I've heard people say the 50s were such a nicer, calmer time. Yeah, it may be true if you lived a middle-class life. If you were a poor person in Mississippi and black, probably the 50s weren't better. And then you look back in history and you see, like in the time of the Bible, where people were just being wiped out by these empires who would come through and enslave people and kill people. And suddenly you realize, it's not like life is all that horrible now compared to other times. Life has always, at times, been brutal and hard. And so as I was thinking about it, what I realized is that there's never been a perfect world. There has never been a perfect world. There's no golden past. There may be a time that was good for you or for your area, but there's always been brokenness. There's always been hurt in different areas. All there's ever been is a choice to act in faith and work towards things that are good and work towards hope, or to act otherwise, right? To despair and to get cynical and to work towards things that do not bring hope. And I was thinking about the reading we have today, where Paul says that we're all called to give because of what we give thanks. And he says, God loves a cheerful giver. And if you know a little bit about the history of when Paul was writing, and you ask, was it easy to be a Christian at that time? Was it easy to be a Christian when Paul was telling the early church, you should be a cheerful giver? And what you realize is, no, it wasn't. This was a time when the church was being persecuted. This is a time when people were being thrown in jail and worse for being Christian, where people were losing family relationships because being a Christian was very divisive at this time. And yet he tells the community, give thanks and give back, right? Share with the ministry, share with those in need. And amazingly, even though it was a hard time for Christians to be Christian, they chose to hold on to the hope. They chose to give back. And I think they did this because even though life was hard in certain ways, they had experienced something powerful in their Christian life. They had experienced a community that nowhere else was offering, where rich and poor gathered together, where the God they were worshiping was about love rather than just this angry kind of figure. And so even though it was hard to be Christian, they gave thanks, and they became this tremendously generous community that was known for caring for the poor and sharing with people in common. And because of this, even though it was hard to be Christian, pretty soon Christianity swept the Roman Empire because people looked at the community and they said, I want that. I want to be part of something like that. So that's the first thing, that giving happens when we don't wait for hope to happen, but when we actually actively create it in the world. The second thing is that giving happens when we celebrate the gifts we do have rather than worry about the gifts that we don't have. It's interesting, when you look at the 10 Commandments, 2 of them are about coveting. Don't covet your neighbor's horse or wife or a house. People break it up differently, but the word covet's a fancy word for jealousy, right? Basically, don't be jealous. It's interesting that God chose to make 2 of the commandments about jealousy. But, when you think about human life and how it can be, you see that, it's true that it could be very easy to make life about what you lack. It could be very easy to live your life in a way where you're always seeing what other people have, how they're blessed, and just to become kind of bitter and feel like, I wish I had that. Oh, and this person has this. I wish I had that. And look how beautiful they are. I wish I was like that. Whatever it is, it could be a million different things. But the problem with this kind of mindset is that it never ends. If we list off all the things we don't have, that could be almost an endless list. There's a famous line from the movie Star Wars. I love Star Wars, where Luke Skywalker is trying to convince Han Solo to rescue Princess Leia when they're first meeting her. And they don't know her yet, but Luke is kind of a good guy. He wants to do it because he actually cares. Han Solo is a scoundrel. He doesn't really want to risk his life. And so Luke says, we should rescue her. And he realized that Han isn't really convinced. So he says, she's rich. And Han Solo says, well, how rich? And he says, more than you can imagine. And Han Solo says, I don't know. I can imagine quite a bit. And that is how life is. We can imagine quite a bit if our whole lives are wrapped up in what we don't have, what we wish we had, being jealous of other people. That is what we call a scarcity mindset, where there's not enough, where I don't have enough, where I wish I had more. Jesus invites us, on the other hand, into an abundance mindset. A mindset of abundance where we actually see what we do have and we celebrate those things and give back from them rather than worrying about what we don't. One of the real mentors and lights in my life at my previous church was a nun in Bismarck called Sister Kathleen. I think I talked about her before, but during my time there, she started from the ground up a brand new nonprofit called Ministry on the Margins, which served like a bunch of homeless people and gave them food and so on. And she had this saying, when homeless and poor people would come, they didn't have everything to give. Sometimes people would say, "Can you give me $1,000 of rent for this month?" And the answer was no, they didn't have that to give. But they would collect food, and they would collect clothing, and they would collect all kinds of stuff. They would have social workers there. And she always had this saying where we don't have much, but what we have, we are happy to share with you. And what a wonderful attitude in life to say, I may not have much in certain areas, but what I have, I'm happy to share. And this is the same kind of spirit that motivates the widow in today's gospel story, right? She doesn't have much, but she gives of what she has. And so like Tiffany lifted up in her Thanksgiving story, there are different seasons of giving. We are not gifted the same, but we are all gifted. And so God invites us to ponder from an abundance mindset, what do I have, rather than worrying about what I don't have, and to give from the abundance wherever you find it in your life. And then the third thing is that giving happens when we take the time to celebrate when God allows our giving to bear fruit, right? So when we notice that our giving, whether it's my giving or our giving together, actually makes an impact. And it's so easy to just kind of do things and then forget about them and not notice the impact. But it's a good thing to do in life. We talked about the scarcity mindset where you just ask yourself, what don't I have? To flip that around and say, how would my life be different if I didn't have, and then name your blessing. It could be your family, it could be your home, it could be food, it could be any number of things. We had a wonderful funeral yesterday for Gladys Precker, a 99-year-old saint of this church who recently passed away. To hear the ways that in 99 years that woman blessed her family and this community, supporting the church, inspiring a love of nature in her children. She had this really inclusive family that was a mix between her background and Native American people. It was inspirational. And so those kids were talking about how their life would have been different if it hadn't been for Gladys Precker. And in this season of giving for our church, we invite you to think about, for COJ, how would our life be different if we didn't have community of joy, if we didn't have God's people? And as we've been hearing with these wonderful Thanksgiving stories, there are so many ways that the world would be poor without this community and other communities like us, other churches. The giving we do to the poor, the community that people find, the prayers, the support, the love, the worship, the music. There are so many ways that we're blessed through this community. And so God has blessed us with everything we need to live good, abundant lives. It doesn't mean that every day is easy. It doesn't mean that there's not hardships. But it means that we have gifts to share in order to proclaim God's unconditional love. And so this month, we invite you to ponder where your gift is, where your abundance is, and to think about how you can give back to support the things that God is doing in this world. Amen.
Amen.